Creativity, imagination, ingenuity, freshness, originality, a flair for solving problems. Most people believe creativity is a special gift, an innate capacity possessed by the lucky few. The common view is you either have it or you don't, and if you don't, there is little or nothing to be done about it, except to take your problem to someone who does. Some years ago, as its final exam, a creative engineering class at MIT was given an hour in which to remove 3 ping-pong balls from an 8-foot length of sewer pipe, 4 inches in diameter. The pipe had been bolted firmly upright in the middle of the floor. The students were only allowed to use the few materials by chance brought with them or already there in the room. If anybody came up with a working solution, everybody passed. If not, everybody flunked. At the end of the hour, the ping-pong balls remained at the bottom of the pipe. Everyone had flunked the exam, and new fuel had been added to the popular view that creativity is something only a gifted few, in this case none at all, possess. The solution? Oh yes, sorry. There was on hand in the lab, as always, an ample supply of drinking water, which, if poured into the pipe, would have floated the ping-pong balls up to within easy reach of the top. There is another, radically different view of creativity. J.P. Guilford wrote, "Whatever the more creative person has seems to be no different from what the rest have, except in degree." And Abraham Maslow called creativity a characteristic potentially given to all human beings at birth. In a series of landmark experiments, psychologists found that whether or not we bring our creative potential into play depends far more than we're usually aware of on how others treat us.
Good.
When subjects undergoing tests for creativity are rewarded, even with tokens for their unique responses, they invariably come up with a significantly greater number of original ideas.
Interesting. Excuse me. Now, please continue, and when you're finished, leave the papers on my desk. And reward yourself if you think you deserve it. Okay?
Surprisingly, even if the experimenter leaves in mid-test, subjects nevertheless continue to score higher for creativity. Implications? Positive reinforcement increases our ability or willingness to be creative. If other people convey to us a high regard for our abilities, we make their support our support. And once we've internalized it, their presence is no longer required. We willingly shift to rewarding ourselves. Unfortunately, just as we internalize praise, we also tend to internalize criticism, even from those whose opinion we think doesn't matter.
What's that supposed to be?
A tree.
Doesn't look like a tree to me.
Part of it.
I think few adults admit to themselves how much encouragement they need and how susceptible they are to criticism. We don't like to think that our confidence hangs so closely on the opinion of other people or even what we feel other people think about us and our work.
Professor James L. Adams of Stanford University's School of Engineering.
Yeah, there's very definitely risk in creativity. I think what we're really risking is our self-esteem. If you criticize an idea I have, I can interpret that as a negative comment about my self-worth. It's silly, but it's the way people are.
An engineer by training, Dr. Adams was employed at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, where he contributed to the design of the first Mars and Venus spacecraft. His book, Conceptual Blockbusting, A Guide to Better Ideas, reflects his special interest in the psychological deterrents to creative problem solving and ways of overcoming them.
Jim, what's the difference between creative problem solving and just plain old problem solving?
Well, creativity to me is problem solving where there's nothing in my own experience that gives me a clean model for a solution. I have to somehow reach out and make new combinations in order to come up with an answer. One way to think of creativity is in terms of a chart such as this, which one often finds in the literature if one's reading on creativity. These charts are misleading because problem solving is messier than this. But problem solving is generally considered to start with problem definition, and after that, idea production, which is the conceptual part of the process. The idea evaluation and decision then follow, because you have to pick an idea. Detail and optimization are necessary to fill in the nuts and the bolts. Action planning, then implementation and feedback as to where you're successful. 1 and 2 are often identified with so-called creative people who are paid primarily to be creative. 3 through 7 are more identified with people in control situations, such as managers and administrators. Now, there's a little bit of conflict between the type of thinking that does 1 and 2 for you and the type that does 3 through 7. And depending on how this conflict is handled, organizations or individuals can either be very productive at problem solving or not. There's a concept used by Peter Drucker where he talks about lunatics and administrators as being opposing forces in an organization. The lunatics associate with 1 and 2, and the administrators 3 through 7. Now that's neither very flattering nor really true, because administrators have to be able to have concepts, and idea people have to be able to implement. There's a similar conflict in our own minds. We have internal administrators and internal lunatics, and depending how we as individuals handle that conflict, we also can be very productive at problem solving or not so good.
In the Freudian scheme of things, our internal creative lunatic would be identified with the primary activating force in the unconscious mind. Freud called it the id. The id is the instinctive animal part of ourselves, and the ideas it releases reflect no concern with morality or logic. The functions of our internal administrator would be shared by 2 other psychic entities, the ego and the superego. Ideas originating in the unconscious must be subjected to their scrutiny if they are to be allowed into the conscious mind. They reject far more than they accept. The ego is the socially aware aspect of ourselves. It may reject an idea because it can't be realistically carried out. The superego is the moralistic portion of ourselves. It forbids and prohibits. It may reject ideas that threaten propriety. If the ego and the superego are too selective, few, if any, creative ideas will reach the conscious mind. If they're not selective enough, a torrent of very original but extremely impractical and sometimes shocking ideas will emerge. The more contemporary split brain theory would associate our internal administrator with the left hemisphere of the brain. the left half of the cortex is mainly concerned with analytic thinking, particularly with language and logic. It seems to process information in a linear, sequential fashion. Under the split brain theory, our internal lunatic would be associated with the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere integrates material in a less ordered, more simultaneous manner. It appears to be responsible for our body awareness, orientation in space, and for our visual memory. It is the right hemisphere of the brain that remembers the face, but cannot recall the name. The right hemisphere also appears to be the seat of artistic talent, the beginning place of creative ideas.
A good manager has to be an ambidextrous thinker. There are a lot of functions in management which are converging, where you have to be analytical and quantitative, where you have to communicate, that require left brain thinking. There are other functions where you have to be more conceptual, where you have to be more integrative, that require right brain thinking. Without the two, you're very handicapped as a manager. That can be tough for some people. People who are used to operating in this area, the convergent stages of problem solving, sometimes have difficulty operating up here. This is very psychologically threatening territory. There are no right answers, there are no road maps, there is no one way to do things. One has to rely on one's basic creativity. That's why a lot of us, when we have a problem, grab the first concept we think of and run with it, even though we may run straight off a cliff. That's not the right way to solve problems. We should spend enough effort up here to ensure that we have a rich store of concepts and can therefore select a good one. As Linus Pauling said, the best way to get a good idea is to have lots of ideas.
Jim, you've got problem definition as part of the creative functions, and I've always thought that it belonged more in parts 3 through 7, the objective logical part of thinking.
Sometimes problems can be attacked in a very logical way. However, often problem definition requires a very high degree of creativity. The apparent problem is usually not the real problem. We often find problem statements that are so broad that a great amount of time and effort is spent looking for the real difficulty. We often find problem statements that are too narrow.
Over the years, large-scale tomato farming was plagued by a nearly insupportable high rate of loss due to damage of the delicate fruit during harvest. The problem was defined as one of mechanical design. A great deal of hard work and mental anguish went into redesigning and improving various prototype tomato pickers, with little or no appreciable success. Finally, it occurred to someone that the real problem was not in the inadequacies of the harvester. Rather, it was in the tomato's susceptibility to damage during harvest. The redefined problem was passed on to a group of experimental horticulturists. Their solution? A new hybrid tomato plant that produces tougher-skinned, more easily accessible fruit.
You ever seen this puzzle?
Yes, I've seen it, but I'm not sure I remember the point of it.
Okay, come over here a minute. The point of the puzzle is to draw no more than 4 interconnected straight line segments that somehow pass through all 9 dots.
All right, let me get it straight. You want the 9 dots connected by 4 lines.
Exactly.
Why don't you show me what the answer is?
Okay. Here's one answer.
You know, it's interesting because I find myself somewhat angry by the fact that I forgot the solution.
That's a very normal reaction. One reason you're angered is, like most puzzles, there's a very powerful gimmick here.
And the gimmick is?
The gimmick is a perceptual block. One of the things that's very important in the perceptual process is memory. It's our data bank, and it's very structured and it's filled with things that are familiar. So when we look at this 9 dots, we see a square. We see a fence around the 9 dots. And it's very difficult for us to perceive solutions that go outside of that fence. There are probably emotional factors at work here also, because many people, after they've thought of a solution, think that they're somehow cheating or violating a taboo.
From our earliest experience, we develop a deep unconscious respect for squares and rectangles. In our culture, these man-made shapes, which seldom if ever occur in nature, play a profound role in determining both our sense of security and our sense of limitation. So strong and pervasive are these symbols that their effects are felt throughout our lives.
You said that this represented one solution. What are the others?
Oh, there are many. Would you reach behind you?
Sure. This what you had in mind?
Yeah, this is the solution I received shortly after I started using this problem from a person who attended a workshop I put on. And it shows how you can pass through the 9 dots with 3 lines. Now, my reaction to that was depression, because even though this is my shtick, I just never even considered that you didn't have to go through the middle of the dots. This is an interesting one, a brutal one, but you can just simply cut the 9 dots apart with the scissors and glue them together in a straight line and go through it with 1 line. In fact, if you violate the 2-dimensional format, you can roll it up and draw a spiral, which is in a sense a single line, and also draw through all 9. I recently got a letter from a person with 25 solutions to this puzzle, each one unique, each one labeled. For instance, he had the Magellan, in which case you place the puzzle on the Earth and circumnavigate the globe 3 times, passing 1 time through each one. The Las Vegas, where you crumple it up, stick a pin through it, and bet with your friends about whether you'd gone through all the dots. 23 other beautiful ones. In fact, I collect them now. If you know anybody with some answers, please refer them to me.
You got a deal.
The difficulty with most of us is that the way we're raised, and our parents have the best intentions, they put a very heavy emphasis on not making mistakes. Not necessarily being right, but don't make mistakes. And so we're brought up cautious. And in order to speculate, you got to accept you're going to make mistakes. You're going to be confused. You're going to say nutty things that are easily attacked.
George M. Prince, chairman and co-founder of Synectics Incorporated, a problem-solving lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts, noted for its innovative approaches to group creativity.
My mission in Synectics, as the R&D department all rolled into one person, is to figure out ways to help people use more of that potential that we all have that mostly lies unused. It's been useful to me in explaining to people some of the things that I see happening after watching so many of them, to think of myself as split into 2 selves. One self, his job is to keep me safe, keep me from making mistakes, errors in judgment, that kind of thing. I call that my safekeeping self. The other self is the self that wants to learn from everything, has the impulses to grab things and feel and figure out what's going on. And I call that my experimental self. And those 2 selves are at odds quite often. And to make it even worse, the safekeeping self tends to punish my experimental self for getting silly ideas and wanting to do things. And what we really aim to do is to get people, to get those 2 selves to cooperate, to work together.
If self-punishment is one side of the coin, self-confidence is the other. And we need self-confidence in order to be creative. This often amounts to something of a bind, because we need to be creative in order to have self-confidence. Far more than we're usually aware of, our self-confidence depends on the confidence, or lack of it, we feel others have in us and our abilities. Dimly ashamed of this dependency, we tend to mask it, even from ourselves. Any approach to group creative problem solving that works starts with the recognition that internal climate, how we treat ourselves, is largely determined by external climate, how we treat each other. Aware of this, advertising executive Alex Osborne in the late 1930s developed a group problem-solving technique called brainstorming. Still much in use, brainstorming was specifically designed to inhibit those inhibitions that diminish the flow of ideas in a group. Brainstorming groups usually consist of 5 to 10 members at work on a specific problem. Their behavior is governed by 4 main rules. First, permit no evaluation of any kind, because evaluation gets people into attacking and defending ideas rather than producing them. Second, all are encouraged to come up with the wildest ideas possible, because it's easier to tame a wild idea than to invigorate a timid one. Third, quantity of ideas is encouraged rather than quality. Finally, all are encouraged to build on and modify the ideas of others, because, as Osborne said, combinations or modifications of previously suggested ideas often lead to new ideas that are superior to those that sparked them.
Okay, last couple, in your companies or organizations or in the community that you're in, what challenges, aspirations, goals might this present?
How can we find out what the senior citizens really want in courses or programs?
Corporations can bring back the senior citizens, retirees, as senior counselors for young staff employees.
For younger staff members.
Let's give them something exciting to do. Send them on trips to the moon.
Sidney Parnes, president of the Creative Education Foundation.
Most people tend to think of problem solving as crisis-oriented. Something happens to you and then you respond to it or you react to it. We can deal with that type of thing, and you can use the creative problem-solving processes for it. But what we're equally or even more concerned with is getting people to begin to anticipate and to look forward so that they're not reacting, but they are proacting, so to speak. We use the term, let's shock the future rather than suffering future shock, you see. Let's make change happen instead of reacting to change. And I think this is the type of thing that people that participate in these kinds of programs over and over begin to form attitudes of this type and tend to form a more positive thrust in their dealing with their environment. Instead of just reacting to the environment, they're changing the environment. Now we're going to look at these and see which one would turn us on to start to explore, to see what we could make happen.
It would be exciting for our public agencies to feel that they...
Now in the session, for example, you saw people looking at a situation about the geriatrics problem or the senior citizen problem. And many people would look at that same situation, and when you told them that half the people in the nation by the end of the century were going to be senior citizens, they'd begin to get very gloomy. Maybe, my goodness, what's going to happen? How are we going to support them? What are they going to do? And so forth and so on. And what we did is look at it and say, all right, now these are the facts, and there's a lot of problems there. But what about opportunities and challenges? As we look at that situation, what might jump out at us as a real challenge to turn that into almost say what's good about it? What could lead to some very creative, constructive action if we look at it positively? And then that's that attitude question, you see. But then not only the attitude, but okay, how might we define this in ways that we can constructively start to ideate on it and use the brainstorming processes and the deferred judgment processes to come up with some whole new approaches to it. The simplest thing that management does day in and day out, knowingly or unknowingly, to discourage creativity is to use what we call killer phrases constantly. As soon as I have an idea, somebody tells me it won't work, we tried it last year, it's not in the budget, control won't ever accept it, etc., you see. And we have lists of these, and you can compile such a list with a group in 5 minutes, and they have a ball over it because they all know it, they've all felt it. The verbals and the nonverbals that the boss or the manager gives to the person when they bring up an idea can kill or can foster ideas. Management can aid creativity in many ways. Probably the most succinct way I could say is to provide what I would call a climate for creativity. A climate, if you will, for deferred judgment. An almost organizational set for deferred judgment, where people understand that everything will be evaluated very carefully, but that they can play with ideas and talk about them and experiment with them, knowing that they will be very critically examined by themselves and others before they're put to the test. This is the beauty of the mind, because it allows for the spinning of ideas a mile a minute, knowing that the mind also has the capacity to evaluate them, you see. And the organization can do the same thing.
Any contractor see any change in their flight readiness?
No.
Okay. I know everybody's a little frustrated. So our 4 scrub in the last month. But let's work on a quick turnaround, huh?
The process by which we reach decisions in groups and organizations has been the subject of scrutiny for decades.
Let's schedule launch for 0938 tomorrow morning.
This has led to increasingly complex procedures in an attempt to guarantee the success of group decisions, in keeping with the growing complexity of our goals and our technology.
24-hour turnaround. Go with a soft count. Right, Gene. 4, 3, 2, and there it goes, folks. The countdown has begun.
Nevertheless, decision-making itself remains a very human activity, and therefore subject to human error. The tragedy of the Challenger accident and many other catastrophic events can be traced in part to the group decision-making process that leads to them. Among the causes of faulty group decisions, few have received more attention or study than in groupthink. Simply stated, groupthink is a mode of thinking in which group members' premature striving for agreement somehow overrides their ability to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. When and why does this groupthink occur? Ironically, it may stem from the very bonds that draw us together into groups in the first place. In the early 70s, renowned psychologist Dr. Irving Janis first identified groupthink and theorized it could be brought on by something he called group cohesiveness.
Well, basically, a cohesive group is one whose members are very positive in their feeling toward the group and are very strongly motivated to retain their membership in the group. Now, you can look at executive committees, work groups of various types, friendship cliques, athletic teams. All of these show characteristic signs of group cohesiveness. You see very strong esprit de corps, strong feelings of solidarity, sense of we feeling that pervades the group, and it has a very profound effect on their morale and on their readiness to carry out the tasks of the group, and above all, to live up to the norms of the group. One of the consequences of high cohesiveness is a tendency for the members of the group to try to strive toward agreement, and this is a concurrence-seeking tendency that is at the core of groupthink.
Since Dr. Janis first developed the groupthink hypothesis, psychologists have discovered a number of additional factors that can predispose group members to engage in groupthink. A highly insulated group with restrained access to outside ideas, a stressful decision-making context, such as that brought on by budgetary restraints, external pressure, or a history of recent setbacks. Isolation, stress, budgetary pressures, factors we all commonly face in a wide variety of decision-making situations. But how do the dynamics of groupthink actually originate? And how can we avoid becoming victims of groupthink in our own organizations? To answer this, we first need to take an in-depth look at the group interactions that can lead up to an unsuccessful group decision.
Come on over. I hear you've had a couple of new thoughts.
Yes, I do. I wrote a memo to Bob Lund about it.
Well, what's the meat of it? Would you mind telling us?
Since Flight 17, we know something we didn't know before. The primary O-ring can fail completely. If that ever happens in one of the major sections of the rocket, it's a jump ball as to whether the joint holds or fails. If it fails, there'll be a catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life. The shuttle, the launch pad, all of it.
Roger, you're keyed up about the O-ring problem because O-rings is what you work on. It's what you see every day. Now, we got to fix this O-ring problem. There's no question about that. But, Roger, the shuttle has flown 19 times, and it's come back 19 times. Our job isn't to run around like Chicken Little hollering the sky is falling. It's to keep that shuttle flying.
I think everybody's hooked up.
Arnie Thompson and Roger Boisjolet have been doing the research. They'll make the presentation.
The Air Force estimates 29 degrees at launch tomorrow morning.
We have no data on O-rings operating at temperatures this low.
So determining if this extreme cold will affect the O-rings, and if it does, how much is critical.
So our recommendation is, you should see it on the sheet coming through now, not launching until the temperature is at least 53 degrees.
Whoa. Wait a minute. Am I looking at the right charts? Charts I've got don't support that conclusion.
They do. I think they do.
Well, you began by saying what you're presenting can't be proved. And I agree, it can't. But now you're drawing serious conclusions from it, and you're making very serious recommendations.
Serious recommendations are called for.
Well, of course, that's why we're here. But what you're saying sounds like Morton Thiokol is establishing new launch commit criteria the night before a launch. Now, these solid rocket boosters have been operating under very definite specifications. You suddenly want to change them. You now want to base everything on this 53-degree benchmark. At that rate, it could be spring before the shuttle would fly. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
I don't think we want to change launch commit criteria. We're trying to see if it's safe to launch with the O-rings experiencing these severe temperatures.
All right, I'm looking at your chart on Flight 15. There was erosion. But the worst erosion we've ever had was on Flight 2, and the temperature outside was 70 degrees. Now, where in what you're presenting is the correlation between low temperature and erosion? Your charts even seem to support the opposite.
All I'm saying is that launching it below freezing is an act away from goodness. All I'm saying is we should go by our experience base, as limited as that is. And our experience base says that at 53 degrees or less, we can expect increased erosion and blow-by.
Roger, it's my understanding that the solid rocket boosters are qualified by contract for operation between 40 and 90 degrees. This 53-degree specification would be setting a new benchmark. Are the solids qualified at 40 degrees or aren't they?
It's away from goodness to make any other recommendation.
Listen. If being in the direction of goodness means wanting a successful result for this mission, I want that result. Everybody involved in this telecon wants it. Be reassured, Roger, you are not in the direction of goodness by yourself. But we've got an engineering decision to make here. And it's got to be made on quantifiable data. Now, I want to ask Joe Kilminster for his recommendation.
Based on this presentation by our engineers here at Morton Thiokol, I can't recommend a launch.
I think we should get George Hardy's comments.
Well, let me ask first, does Thiokol have any more to transmit? Any further views? Because if not, I'm appalled that they could arrive at the recommendation not to launch given the data that's been presented, especially so late on the evening before a launch. I agree with Larry Malloy. I make the same assessment he does. But if Thiokol recommends not launching, I'm certainly not going to override it.
We'd like to go offline for 5 minutes here and have a conference.
All right.
I want to make sure I've got this. The worry is the temperatures in the 20s or 30s could cause the primary O-ring to seal more slowly. If it did, we could get some blow-by.
That's right.
But don't we have some tests that show how the O-rings behave?
We have tests showing that even if the blow-by cut 125 thousandths of an inch out of the O-ring, it would still seal.
I'll tell you, it makes an impression on me if George Hardy says he's appalled at something we recommend.
His point is, and I think you have to listen to it, is that even if you get blow-by of the primary O-ring, the secondary O-ring is still in the proper position to seal.
Our charts may be inconclusive, our data insufficient, but everything we do have shows we'll be safe for launching at 53 degrees or above.
That's clear. That's absolutely clear.
It's time to make a decision. Bob, take off your engineer's hat and put on your management hat.
You're right about that.
This is Joe Kilminster. We've assessed the data and reviewed all our charts. Even though we had some concerns about the low temperatures, we now recommend proceeding with the launch.
Does anyone in the loop have a different position?
Was groupthink responsible in part for the decision to launch Challenger? And what part does groupthink play in the numerous group decisions each of us faces every day in our personal and organizational lives? Dr. James K. Esser is among a number of researchers studying modern organizational decision-making, including the effects of groupthink.
In 1972, Dr. Janus identified 8 symptoms of groupthink, which have since been examined in a number of laboratory and case studies. And when more of these symptoms are present, the likelihood is greater that groupthink has occurred, and therefore the probability is higher that any resulting decision will be unsuccessful, possibly even catastrophic.
The first symptom occurs when group members develop an illusion of invulnerability.
Roger, it's my understanding that the solid rocket boosters are qualified by contract for operation between 40 and 90 degrees.
Members come to feel that the group is somehow immune from error, that procedural or technological backup systems will safeguard us from any negative outcome.
Even if you get blow-by of the primary O-ring, the secondary O-ring is still in the proper position to steal.
This illusion of invulnerability has played a key role in other historical decisions. Example, Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. Admiral Kimmel and his staff make a decision of their own to ignore repeated warnings from Washington that attack from Japan is imminent. The result? The destruction of the U.S. fleet and the loss of thousands of lives in what has been called the worst military disaster in American history. An exhaustive investigation reveals that Kimmel and his advisors apparently shared and acted upon an extreme sense of invulnerability right up until the end, as the first bombs began to explode.
This illusion of invulnerability is often linked with another illusion, that of the inherent morality of the group, the belief that whatever the group decides must be the ethical and proper choice.
Ironically, this belief in the inherent morality of the group may actually lead us to ignore very real ethical and moral consequences of a decision.
If being in the direction of goodness means wanting a successful result for this mission, I want that result. Everybody involved in this telecon wants it.
Such unquestioned faith in our own morality helps us protect something we will go to great lengths to defend: our self-esteem.
So far, we've looked at ways in which we overestimate the group itself, leading to faulty expectations of the consequences of group actions. But sometimes we also close our minds in groups, just when successful decision-making requires an open mind.
One way we may do this is through rationalization. For instance, focusing upon past success as a guarantee of future success.
But Roger, the shuttle has flown 19 times and it's come back 19 times.
Such shared rationalizations perform a dangerous function. They allow us to downplay any information that conflicts with group opinions.
But don't we have some tests that show how the
We have tests showing that even if the blow-by cut 125 thousandths of an inch out of the O-ring, it would still seal.
Through rationalization, we close our minds to information available to us from within the group. However, we may also close our minds to ideas from outside the group through the use of negative stereotypes of outsiders.
The we feeling engendered by groupthink often generates a corresponding they feeling towards those outside the group.
Yet another costly red faces all around space shuttle launch delay. This time
the group may come to perceive, however mistakenly, that outsiders are overly critical of the group.
And the confidence in NASA's ability to maintain a launch schedule has been rocked.
Even that they are out to get them.
NASA admitted they goofed.
Ironically, through such stereotyping of outsiders, the group also becomes less receptive to valid criticism from legitimate sources. The result is further isolation.
So, closed-mindedness, fostered by the group, has enabled them to move towards a faulty consensus. All that is needed now is for the group to develop ways to reinforce conformity. One of these occurs when the group displays subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms of self-censorship.
Members may perceive such censorship as being imposed on them by the group itself. It isn't.
Does anyone in the loop have a different position?
Rather, it stems from the willingness to devalue our own individual ideas when they are in conflict with the known values of the group. Another historical example. In April of 1961, President Kennedy and his advisors make a decision to send a brigade of Cuban exiles to the Bay of Pigs. Their goal? The overthrow of Fidel Castro's communist government. The result was the greatest foreign policy fiasco of Kennedy's administration. Later, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and others who had been party to the decision described their failure to express their own doubts about the decision. In effect, they had self-censored their own thoughts, at the same time depriving the group of vital input that might have prevented a disastrous course of action. But what about those situations where someone does speak out? In such cases, the group may apply direct pressure to members who appear to disagree.
Are the solids qualified at 40 degrees or aren't they?
Any deviation from the presumed group consensus may be met with scorn, even outright ridicule.
At that rate, it could be spring before the shuttle would fly. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
Such direct pressure makes it clear that dissent or argument against the group consensus is somehow unacceptable, even disloyal.
I'm appalled that they could arrive at the recommendation not to launch, given the data that's been presented.
I'll tell you, it makes an impression on me if George Hardy says he's appalled at something we recommend.
One of the most interesting ways in which group members are pressured into uniformity is by the presence of what are called mind guards. Just as a bodyguard protects our bodies from physical damage, a mind guard protects the group from exposure to ideas that might threaten group assumptions.
This happens in a number of ways. For instance, the discouraging of others from expressing their true doubts or beliefs.
Our job isn't to run around like Chicken Little hollering the sky is falling.
Or in some cases, even by the suppression of documents or other information, in effect, preserving the group's shared complacency.
I wrote a memo to Bob Lund about it.
The memo in question, stamped company private. NASA decision makers never saw it.
By self-censoring doubts, through direct pressure, and through mind guards, the group is able to maintain its false unity. This can lead to what may be the most disturbing symptom of all, the illusion of unanimity.
Those who may have spoken out are subtly reminded that the group norm is one of agreement, not discord.
Be reassured, Roger, you are not in the direction of goodness by yourself.
Any threat to the atmosphere of agreement is discounted.
I don't think we want to change launch commit criteria.
Members are encouraged to get with the program and to move the group further ahead toward the decision.
Bob, take off your engineer's hat and put on your management hat.
The group's high regard for agreement has now overridden any realistic consideration of alternatives.
Even though we had some concerns about the low temperatures,
We now recommend proceeding with the launch.
Are groups somehow preordained to develop groupthink and therefore to suffer the consequences of faulty decision-making? Not necessarily. Research suggests that the leader can initiate and lead groups in ways which can foster a positive decision-making.
Successful.
Now, it seems to me that the kinds of procedures that were used in that particular decision have potentially very wide applicability to preventing groupthink in many other situations, in many other kinds of groups.
One of the prime goals of the Challenger mission was educational. And though the mission ended in tragedy, it'd be doubly tragic if we were to neglect a vital lesson it holds for us.
Well, let's go home now.
No matter how sophisticated our technology, the successful attainment of our collective goals will always depend upon our individual courage to confront, to reason, and to make decisions together.
Good night. Some rest, Larry.
Yeah.
मानत नाही रे पिया